Hello, my dear friends. Day 12 of our Advent devotions. This is part 2 of what we started yesterday, still in 2 Samuel. You remember yesterday we talked about David's bright idea to build a temple, to build a permanent place, to replace the tabernacle, where God's people could worship, where the Ark of the Covenant could be located. And how God came to David and said, no, that's not how it's going to work. God says, you're not going to build a house for me, David. I'm going to build a house for you. And in that promise, God told David that his dynasty, that is his family, his household, would be established forever, which brings us to Jesus as a descendant of David, as one in that royal dynasty, one who then becomes king over God's people. There's something else going on here, though, also. Remember, David's idea is to build a permanent temple, to build a house, a building where God's people could come to worship, to build a place to replace that tabernacle as the place where God would dwell, as the place where God would meet his people. Remember, that was the purpose of the tabernacle. It was a place where God could meet his people, where God's people could come to meet him. It was sort of the physical location, the manifestation of God in the world, the place where God was. And so David, I think, give him credit, wants to make this a permanent thing. But it's not his job. That task of building the permanent temple falls to David's son, Solomon, who does indeed build a permanent temple, a beautiful temple in Jerusalem on what we now call the Temple Mount. Solomon builds it. It lasts for a few hundred years. It's destroyed and rebuilt during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And it is further expanded and beautified by Herod the Great. Remember Herod, the one that killed all the babies in Bethlehem? One of the things that he did was this beautiful improvement of the temple, making it really, truly a grand building that was admired by people across the Roman Empire of the time. So God does make this place, God's people make this place in Jerusalem where the Ark of the Covenant is stored and where God promises to meet his people. And for centuries, this is the central point of worship. This is the place where God promises to meet his people. And then Jesus shows up. There's this great verse early in John's Gospel, in John chapter 2, actually, where his authority is being challenged by some of the leaders. And they're asking for a sign. Jesus says, what sign are you going to, or the challengers ask, what sort of sign are you going to give us to show that you have authority to be doing these things, to be talking like this? And Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Interesting. The temple, as John goes on to explain a verse or two later, that he was talking about wasn't just that magnificent building. The temple Jesus was talking about was his body. Destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. Death and resurrection. Do you remember during the crucifixion, when Jesus dies? Go back in Matthew's Gospel. What happens at the moment when Jesus breathes his last? The curtain in the temple is torn in two. That is, that big curtain that separates everything else from the most holy place is torn in two. God is no longer there. Where is God? In Jesus. It's the incarnation. The temple, all along, was not the permanent place where God would meet his people. God comes to meet his people in the person of Jesus. Jesus fulfills the role of the tabernacle and the temple. This is the house that God has established eternally the person and work of Christ. In him, that is where God will meet his people. It's one of the reasons we celebrate Christmas. God became flesh and lived among us. He came to meet us. And Christ now is the center of our worship. So, we'll see you again on Monday for more of these devotions. I hope you'll join us for worship tomorrow. God be with you.